When I was a child, my grandmother was a first grade school teacher. She would always try and encourage us to do any kind of craft activities we could do so she was the first one to give me like paint kits and those kinds of things. But she also taught me to knit and to sew and to embroider. Then when I went to college, I was studying painting actually, and was required to take electives in other departments. And my roommates had taken an elective in the fiber department, and they made all sorts of really great things with dyeing and other things. And thought, well, that looks like a fun elective. So the next semester I took an elective in the fiber department, and I met Jane Lackey there, and she taught me to weave. And I learned dyeing, and the next semester I transferred into fiber. And so that was kind of how I came to be in fiber arts, and I've stayed ever since. Jane Lackey, who I worked with at the Kansas City Art Institute when I was an undergraduate, she really, taught me how to weave, taught me how to do other things, but really helped me understand what was exciting about fiber and helped me find a place where I understood how to think through the process and the materials that I was working with. And it wasn't until I started actually really weaving and dyeing and working with fabric that I understood that it was a way of thinking and speaking. And likewise, working with Ann Wilson in Chicago was also transformative graduate school in general. All of those teachers and that time was critical because it helped me go from just feeling like I found something that I like to do and understand to really just sort of understanding my voice and what it was that I wanted to say with those things, and feeling like I could critically take care of, what I needed to do to develop. And when I was finishing undergraduate, these tapestry weavings I was doing, I was taking images from like magazines with boxers and other kinds of athletes in them, and magazines with women as pinup stars. And I was sort of collaging them in a drawing into a kind of landscape, and then I would weave it in a fairly traditional sort of tapestry process of reinterpreting a cartoon of sorts by making my own thing. They were made out of really fine thread. They were probably about 18 to 2 feet long, so fairly small in the scale of tapestry. And these were the things, and they were brightly colored, and sometimes they were in boxes, sometimes they were just tapestries, and they would hang on the wall. And that first group of work, getting myself from painting and from other kinds of things, just learning to weave, to that work, which was the first work about gender. It was the first time I think I really made a body of work and understood what it meant to think through that series, which I called game boxes and had tapestries and collaged boxes, was really, I don't know that any one of them was the most important, but I think all 3 or 5 or however many there were critical for me understanding what it meant to start to go from being a student to being an artist and being directed on my own. So that was incredibly important. When I started making the superhero costumes, it was because I was thinking about ideas of protection and how do you protect your children, but how do you also give them independence? And that can be related to family, but it can also be related to things like 9/11, which happened a couple of years before I started that work. But there's also a part of my work where I want there to be a contradiction or a kind of twist in the work, so that we might say it's about masculinity, but I'm not trying to make something that usually reinforces our expected ideas about it. So I want something unexpected in the work. So by knitting the costumes by hand, I'm immediately sort of calling into question what the hero can do that might be wearing the costume, because they're spending 6 weeks making their costume. And then they're soft. They're made out of acrylic yarn, so it's soft and it's not bulletproof or any of those kinds of things. And again, it's like there's a vulnerability to trying to take care of somebody and to protect them. So the hero should be vulnerable also in those pieces in particular. I mean it to be a little bit pathetic, that the way the costume looks doesn't fulfill the idea of what a superhero looks like. And even that they're made for my size, actually, I am not by any means the kind of muscular looking superhero body that you would expect. And so all of that is meant to be in there to give the kind of personal references and still make it accessible for other folks. And I got this idea while doing that what I needed to do was make my own superhero. So I invented Sweater Man. And Sweater Man was just a way to make the same kinds of costumes, but now it didn't have to look like anybody else's hero. And it could look like a fisherman's cable knit sweater or some other kind of sweater that might exist, to see if those emblems of knitting, instead of being like a bat, could a bunch of cables be the thing that looked inspirational and protective and all that stuff. Being able to then have that lead to almost all the pieces that happened after that. And there were a lot of costumes after that. That was pretty important. I've always been interested in how scars reflect experiences we have, that they can trigger a story. And because, often it's some kind of adventure that happened that you hurt yourself. And there's also this story that I remember from when I was in college where the person teaching textile history, her name was Lou Cabine, she was talking about how in her work, she realized that disasters were memorialized, or people were identified in disasters by the work that their partners had done on their clothing, like mends and repairs on the clothing. And so it made me think about how textiles and skin are connected to each other, that we treat them in similar ways. Because if you damage a really good garment, you repair it and you suture it and you do those kinds of things. And if you hurt your body, if you get a wound or a cut, the doctor stitches it. So stitches are these important things. And the cloth on us is like a second skin. So I just started thinking about how I could merge this idea of repair and healing and scars with cloth. And eventually what that turned into from the costumes was this series of pieces on muslin where I basically was doing kinds of areas of mending surrounded by areas of embroidery. And they were meant to be like patches of skin or landscapes of a body or something like that. And then eventually I moved from making things that looked like a body to using garments, pieces of garments, shirts and things like that, because those had been on bodies. And so instead of making it look like a body, I could just focus on the textile, but it still spoke of memory and repair and body and experience and history. And those continued. That started 2015. They continued. I just had a show actually in June with Jane Lackey here in Detroit. And then I went off on this trip around the country for a while and ended up in Maine for the residency. And I started back on things I had done before, just cutting into pieces of cloth. And so there's actually sort of a piece back there. All the cloth comes from a thrift store in Eastport, where you could go in and buy any garments, you just fill a whole big bag for $2. And it was kind of overwhelming to imagine the cloth and the history that cloth has, that somebody else wore it, or maybe lots of somebody's wore it, and that it carries their memory, but then it also carries references about gender, were these men that wore that? What kind of men were they? And then, by the way, I work into it by cutting into it and mending certain areas or connecting it and suturing it. I'm I'm interested in the way it relates to ideas of skin, but also the way it relates to ideas of community, because these probably weren't garments that were just one person's garments. And so it reflects a whole community of people. They're all sort of cut out basically around the pattern pieces that it took to make them be garments. But then they're collaged back together, and sometimes they're missing parts or they're just little bits of that. And so the backgrounds are really fractured and kind of crazy, like looking at the ground from an airplane or something. And also, yeah, looking at, piles of clothes on the floor if you haven't cleaned up after yourself or something. And to be honest, I don't quite know how to talk about these pieces yet. Which sounds funny because I just did. I think there's a lot that's new in them that I haven't quite figured out yet at 3 pieces in. And I'm looking forward to doing the next set of them and seeing what kinds of new questions and opportunities I ask, because I've worked on these first few, and see what happens. It's a strange place to be in with the costumes. I knew what a costume would be from beginning to end because there was a certain structure in the way I had to knit it. And with the mending work, I kind of upended all of that, and it's much more intuitive process in general. And now, but I developed a certain language about skin and textiles, and now I could still use that, but it doesn't feel quite right. And I just need to give the work a little more time to tell me what I'm doing, I think.